I found a wallet with £300 on the street and took it to the police. A month later, the owner called. "I want to thank you personally." When I saw who it was, I couldn't breathe. The next day, £30 million was deposited into my account. Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also, let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to think that honesty was its own reward, not in a naive way. I wasn't 20 years old anymore. I was 42, divorced, living in a 2-bedroom flat in the Redland area of Bristol, with a tabby cat named Marmalade and a stack of library books on my nightstand that I never quite finished before falling asleep. I worked as a head librarian at Bristol Central Library, a job I had held for 11 years. It paid £42,000 a year before taxes. I drove a 2016 Vauxhall Astra with a cracked dashboard vent and a heating system that took 10 minutes to warm up in February. My life was quiet, orderly, safe. After my divorce from Greg, a civil, dignified ending to 12 years of a marriage that had simply run out of air, I had learned to find comfort in small things. A good cup of tea in the morning, the particular hush of the library before opening hours, evening walks along the harborside, when the light turned amber and the whole city seemed to exhale. I wasn't unhappy, but I also wasn't fully alive, if I'm being honest. I was existing in a comfortable, carefully maintained stillness. The way you hold a breath underwater without quite realizing you've stopped breathing. It was on one of those evening walks, on a Thursday in early October, that I found the wallet. I almost stepped over it. A slim, dark brown leather wallet lying half open against the curb on Park Street near the corner of College Green. A few feet away, a crumpled receipt. No one nearby. The pavement was emptying out as people ducked into restaurants and pubs to escape the early chill. I stopped. I looked down. I picked it up. Inside, £300 in cash, 6 crisp £50 notes, a platinum credit card, a British driving license belonging to someone named Alistair H. Sterling, age 71, with an address in Snade Park, the wealthiest neighborhood in the city. There was also a small photograph creased at the corner of a younger man with silver hair, standing on what looked like a boat dock, squinting into the sun and smiling. And a handwritten note, just 4 words on a business card, "Call if you find." I stood there for a moment on that October pavement, the wallet open in my hands, the wind picking up around me. £300 was not a trivial amount to me. I want to be honest about that. It was a monthly car payment. It was 2 weeks of groceries. The thought passed through my mind, not as a plan, just as a flicker, the way all human minds work, and then it was gone. I took the wallet to the Bridewell police station on Rupert Street. The officer at the desk, a tired-looking woman named Sergeant Miller, took it without particular surprise. She filled out a form, gave me a receipt, and told me the owner would be notified. I drove home. I made tea. I didn't think about it again. Or so I told myself. But the truth is, I thought about that photograph. The man squinting into the sun, the ease in his smile, the way people look when they have never once doubted that life is fundamentally good. I thought about the handwritten note. "Call if you find, not please call." Just the quiet expectation of a person who assumed decency was the default. November came. The leaves dropped from the trees along the river. I returned books, ordered new arrivals, helped a retired teacher find resources on the history of the Great Depression, fixed a jammed printer twice in 1 week. Life moved in its usual slow current. And then, on a gray Tuesday morning, in early November, while I was eating porridge at my kitchen table and listening to the radio, my phone rang. Unknown number. Bristol area code. "Is this Elowyn Thorne?" The voice was low, careful, with the measured quality of a man who had spent decades choosing his words with precision. "Yes," I said. "This is she, Miss Thorne. My name is Alistair Sterling. I believe you found my wallet last month and turned it into the police." I set down my spoon. Alistair Sterling. The name landed in my chest like a stone dropped into still water. Because I knew that name. Everyone in the West Country knew that name. Alistair H. Sterling was the founder and former CEO of Sterling Systems, a technology and infrastructure company worth somewhere in the neighborhood of £4 billion. His face had been on the cover of Business West magazine 3 years in a row. There was a wing of Bristol Royal Hospital for Children named after him. My hand tightened around the phone. "Yes, I managed. Yes, I did. I'd like to thank you properly," he said. "Not many people would have done what you did." I remember staring at the wall across from my kitchen table, the small framed print of a landscape painting. I'd bought it at a museum gift shop years ago, and thinking that the world had just quietly and without warning rearranged itself around me. "That's not necessary," I said, "because what else do you say?" "I think it is," said Alistair Sterling, and something in his voice told me the conversation was already decided. I didn't sleep well that night. I lay in the dark with marmalade curled against my feet, running the conversation over and over in my mind the way you replay a strange dream, looking for the moment it stopped making sense. Alistair Sterling had been gracious on the phone, warm even. He'd asked how I was, where I worked, whether I had lived in Bristol long. He didn't speak like a man performing generosity. He spoke like someone who was genuinely curious. We had talked for perhaps 15 minutes, and by the end of it, I felt oddly settled, as if I'd been speaking with an old acquaintance I hadn't realized I missed. He had mentioned wanting to send something as a token of his gratitude. I had demurred, as I always did. He had laughed softly, not condescendingly, just warmly, and said, "Humor, an old man, Miss Thorne." I had gone to bed thinking he might send flowers, or perhaps a gift card. I had read about wealthy people who sent fruit baskets when they were pleased. What I did not think was possible was what actually happened. At 9:17 the following morning, while I was standing in the library's back office reviewing an overdue notices report, my phone buzzed. A banking notification. I almost dismissed it, but the number in the alert made my thumb stop mid-swipe. Deposit received. 30 million.00. I read it again, and again. I walked to the narrow window that overlooked the library car park and read it a third time, as if the change in location might alter the text on the screen. It did not. 30 million pounds. I sat down very slowly in the office chair and put the phone face down on the desk, as if not looking at it would make it easier to process. My heart was doing something irregular and uncomfortable. Across the hall, I could hear the soft murmur of the children's reading hour. A volunteer reading aloud, something with a dragon in it, children laughing. The ordinary world continuing without interruption. Could it be a mistake? A fraud? Some elaborate scam where a fake billionaire deposited pretend money and then asked for it back? I picked up the phone again and logged into my bank account directly, not through the notification, but through the official app. The balance stared back at me. It was real. The transfer had come from a verified corporate account, registered to Sterling Family Trust. I called in sick for the rest of the day, which I had not done in 3 years. I drove home in a kind of white silence, hands steady on the wheel through pure muscle memory. I sat at my kitchen table. I made tea I didn't drink. I opened my laptop and typed Alistair Sterling's name into the search engine, and then sat there reading for 2 hours. Alistair Harold Sterling. Born 1952 inches Sheffield. Son of a steelworker and a school teacher. Worked his way through the University of Sheffield. Founded Sterling Systems in 1985 inches a rented basement in Bath. Took the company public in 1998. Now a privately held empire. Infrastructure technology, defense contracts, municipal data systems, net worth estimated at £4.2 billion. Widower. 2 children. A daughter, Alara, who lived in London and ran a non-profit, and a son, Benedict Sterling, 45, who served as the company's chief operating officer. One article from 2 years ago caught my eye. A brief item in the Financial Times business section. Just 4 paragraphs. It mentioned a reported dispute between Alistair and Benedict over the future direction of Sterling Systems, with anonymous sources describing tension over succession planning. Alistair, then 69, had reportedly resisted stepping down. The article was short and inconclusive. The kind of story that gets buried when nothing dramatic enough happens to justify a follow-up. I read that paragraph 3 times. I thought about £30 million sitting in my account. I thought about what that kind of money represented to a man like Benedict Sterling, whose father had just given it without apparent consultation to a librarian he had spoken to once on the phone. What would a man like that think? What would he feel? And then I thought, what do I actually do with this? The question wasn't rhetorical. It was practical and urgent and slightly frightening. I was not a wealthy person. I had no financial advisor, no accountant, no wealth manager. I had a workplace pension account with about £67,000 in it, and a savings account with £8,400. I had never in my life needed to think about what one does when £30 million arrives without warning. I made a decision right there at my kitchen table that I would not touch the money. Not £1, not until I understood exactly what it meant, legally, financially, personally. The first thing I needed was a solicitor. Not just any lawyer, someone I could trust, someone with no connection to the Sterling family or their interests, someone who would look at the situation with clear eyes and tell me the truth, even if the truth was complicated. I opened a new browser tab and began to search. My hands, I noticed, were no longer shaking. Something had settled in my chest. Not quite calm, but close to it. The kind of steadiness that comes not from certainty, but from having made a choice. I had found an old man's wallet and done the right thing. Whatever happened next, that was the foundation I was standing on, and I intended to stand on it very firmly. I found Siobhan O'Neill through a Law Society referral and a recommendation from my colleague Beatrice, who had used her during a property dispute 2 years before. Siobhan was 48, sharp, with a direct manner that I immediately trusted. Her office was on the top floor of a city center building on Corn Street, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city. She had the kind of desk that had seen real work. Stacked files, a tea ring on the corner, a yellow legal pad covered in handwriting. I sat across from her on a Wednesday morning, 10 days after the deposit, and told her everything. I showed her the banking records, the transaction details, the name of the originating trust. I told her about the phone call, the wallet, the police report receipt I had kept. Siobhan listened without interrupting, which is a quality I respect enormously in human beings. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me steadily. "The transfer is legitimate," she said. "I've seen the trust registration. Sterling Family Trust is a legally recognized entity. Alistair Sterling is the sole truster, and he retains full authority over discretionary distributions. There is no fraud here. He gave you this money. He had every legal right to do it, and there is no mechanism by which anyone can compel you to return it." I exhaled slowly. "But," Siobhan continued, in the tone that always precedes the part that matters, "legitimate doesn't mean uncomplicated. A gift of this size may have tax implications. We'll need to work with a tax specialist, and depending on Alistair Sterling's family dynamics, you may attract attention you are not prepared for." "His son?" I said. She nodded. "Benedict Sterling has been a named party in 3 civil filings in the last 4 years. 2 involved internal corporate disputes within Sterling Systems. 1 involved a former business partner who claimed he had been deliberately excluded from a revenue-sharing agreement." She paused. "He settled all 3 out of court. What does that tell you?" I asked. "It tells me he protects his interests aggressively and prefers to make problems disappear quietly." She looked at me. "Miss Thorne, I would like to be your solicitor of record on this matter, and I would strongly recommend that you document everything going forward. Every contact, every communication, every attempt by any party to reach you about this money." I agreed immediately. We spent the next 2 hours reviewing the tax implications, the recommended next steps, and a basic strategy for insulating the funds while I decided how to use them. By the time I left her office and walked back out into the cold November air, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not just relief, but clarity, a sense that the ground beneath me was firmer than I had initially feared. I did not yet know that Benedict Sterling had already begun to move. I found out 8 days later, in a way I hadn't anticipated. My upstairs neighbor, a retired postal worker named Arthur, knocked on my door one evening with an awkward expression I had never seen on him before. He told me, with visible discomfort, that 2 men had come by the building that afternoon asking questions about me. They'd said they were doing background research for a business matter and wanted to know if I'd had any recent visitors, any unusual packages, whether my routine had changed lately. Arthur, bless him, had told them nothing and written down their number plate on a piece of paper, which he handed to me. I photographed it immediately and messaged it to Siobhan. She called me back within the hour. The plate came back to a private investigation firm in Gloucestershire that, according to public records she'd been able to pull, had done contracted work for Sterling Systems on at least 2 prior occasions. I stood in my kitchen, phone pressed against my ear, and felt the first true chill of the situation settle in my bones. This wasn't coincidence. This was surveillance. Benedict Sterling was watching me, and he had barely waited 2 weeks to start. "He's trying to assess what you know," Siobhan said. "Whether you're a threat, whether you have legal counsel, whether you're naive enough to be manageable." "Am I?" I asked. "Not anymore," she said. "That night I called Alistair Sterling. He answered on the second ring. I told him calmly what had happened. The investigators Arthur, the number plate. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "I'm sorry," he said finally. Not as a figure of speech, as a man who meant it. "I need to know," I said. "Is your son going to be a problem?" Another pause. When Alistair spoke again, his voice was quiet, but very precise. "Benedict is my son," he said, "and I love him, but he has never fully understood the difference between what belongs to him and what doesn't. I gave you that money because you did something decent when no one was watching. That is my decision to make, and I am not in the habit of reversing my decisions." I wrote those words down in a notebook immediately after we hung up, dated and timed. Evidence. A record. Everything had to be a record now. Siobhan and I had built a plan over the course of 3 careful meetings. It was not dramatic. It was not confrontational. It was methodical. The way only genuinely effective plans are. Step 1. Formally establish the gift with a legal letter from Alistair Sterling, signed and witnessed, confirming the voluntary and irrevocable nature of the transfer. Step 2. Move the funds into a properly structured account with a fiduciary financial advisor, keeping them insulated from any future legal challenge. Step 3. Engage a chartered accountant to record the transfer correctly for inheritance tax purposes, establishing a clean, transparent paper trail. Step 4. Say nothing publicly. Alistair had cooperated immediately, and without hesitation. The witness letter arrived at Siobhan's office within 4 days, on Sterling Family Trust letterhead, worded with a precision that Siobhan described as airtight. She was not a woman who used that word casually. I had said nothing to anyone except Siobhan, Arthur, and Alistair himself. I hadn't posted anything online. I hadn't told my colleagues. I hadn't called my sister in Edinburgh, which took considerable willpower. I had gone to work every morning, shelved books, helped patrons, eaten lunch alone at my desk, and given every outward appearance of a woman whose life had not fundamentally changed. It was one of the stranger performances of my life. But Benedict had his investigators, and investigators, given enough time, pieced things together. It was a Friday afternoon in late November when he came to the library. I recognized him immediately from the photographs I had studied. Benedict Sterling was a tall man, broad-shouldered with his father's silver-streaked hair, worn shorter and styled expensively. He was dressed in a charcoal wool overcoat that cost more than my monthly rent. He walked with the easy authority of someone who had never waited in line for anything. He sat down across from me at the reference desk as if we had a scheduled appointment. "Miss Thorne," he said. "My name is Benedict Sterling." "I know who you are," I said. A brief flicker behind his eyes. He hadn't expected that. He recovered smoothly. "Then I'll skip the introduction. I'd like to talk to you about the money my father transferred to your account." "You're welcome to contact my solicitor," I said. "Siobhan O'Neill. I'll give you her card." I reached for my desk drawer. He put his hand up almost gently. "I don't think we need solicitors for this conversation," he said. "I think we're 2 reasonable adults who can have a straightforward discussion. Reasonable adults. The phrase of someone who wants to make you feel that asking for legal protection is somehow childish or aggressive. I find solicitors clarifying," I said. "They help ensure everyone understands each other correctly." Benedict Sterling looked at me for a long moment. Then he leaned slightly forward. "Miss Thorne, my father is 71 years old. He has been under significant stress this year. He's made several decisions recently that his doctors and I have found concerning. I want you to understand that we may need to revisit this transfer from a capacity standpoint." There it was, clean, almost polite. A threat dressed in medical language. "That's a very serious allegation," I said. "I'd encourage you to raise it with appropriate legal and medical authorities. If there are genuine concerns about your father's cognitive health, that's a matter for professionals, not a conversation in a public library." His expression didn't change, but something behind it did. "You seem very prepared," he said. "I'm a librarian," I said. "Research is what I do." He stood up slowly, buttoned his coat, and looked at me with something that wasn't quite anger. It was more like the cold assessment of a man recalibrating. "I'll be in touch," he said. "Through my solicitor," I said pleasantly. He left. I waited until I heard the library's front door close behind him, and then I went to the staff toilets and stood over the sink for 90 seconds, breathing carefully until my hands stopped trembling. Then I washed my face with cold water, looked at myself in the mirror, and went back to the reference desk. That evening, I called Siobhan and told her every word. She recorded my account while I spoke. The following week, I took 4 days off, something I had not done in years. I drove to the Lake District alone, rented a small cottage near the edge of Windermere, and slept 9 hours a night. I hiked. I read. I sat on the cottage porch in the early morning cold and watched the mist move through the fells below the tree line with a slow, unhurried dignity that I found unexpectedly deeply comforting. When I drove back to Bristol on Thursday evening, I felt something had solidified inside me. Not hardness, solidity. The difference between tension and strength. Benedict Sterling had made his opening move. He had expected me to flinch. I hadn't. And now the question was what he would do next. He didn't wait long. The offer arrived through an intermediary, a man named Geoffrey Strand, who described himself as a family advisor to the Sterlings, and who called Siobhan's office on a Monday morning to propose what he called a mutual resolution. The terms were simple. Elowyn Thorne would return £28 million to the Sterling Family Trust, retaining £2 million as what Geoffrey Strand carefully avoided calling a bribe. And in exchange, Benedict Sterling would cease all legal inquiries, withdraw any questions about his father's mental capacity, and provide a signed agreement guaranteeing no further contact. Siobhan relayed this to me over lunch at a cafe on Gloucester Road, reading from her notes in a flat, professional tone. I sat across from her and stirred my tea. £2 million, I said. Just to hear it out loud. That's what he's offering, Siobhan said. He's offering me $2 million to give back 28 that were legally and voluntarily given to me. Correct. I looked out the window at the street. It was December now, and the first real snow of the season had come in overnight. A thin layer of clean white on the pavements, the city muffled and softened. A woman was walking a large golden retriever that kept stopping to push its nose into snowdrifts with unbridled joy. Was Benedict Sterling actually afraid of me? The thought was both startling and steadying. A man with his resources, his legal team, his family name, and he was sending intermediaries with buyout offers to a librarian from Redland? That told me something important. It told me that whatever legal theory he had about challenging his father's gift, he didn't think it was strong enough to bet on. Tell Geoffrey Strand, I said, turning back to Siobhan, that the answer is no. Siobhan nodded once, as if she had expected nothing else. I want to be clear about something, I continued. I'm not keeping this money to be wealthy. I haven't spent a pound of it. But Alistair Sterling made a decision, a free, informed, deliberate decision, because he believed in human decency. If I take Benedict's deal, I'm not just selling back the money. I'm saying that the right thing to do has a price, that you can undo goodness with enough pressure. Siobhan looked at me for a moment. That's either very principled or very stubborn, she said. Probably both, I admitted. She smiled. It was the first time I had seen her smile. What happened next was something I hadn't fully planned for. I needed people. Not strategy. Not legal analysis. People. Human warmth and the kind of perspective that only comes from being known. I called my university friend Paula, who lived in Bath and who had over 20 years of friendship, talked me through my divorce, my father's death, and a car accident that totaled my first car. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is her greatest gift. And when I finished, she said, Elowyn, you found that wallet because you're the kind of person who looks down. You turned it in because you're the kind of person who does the right thing when no one is watching. Don't let anyone make you feel like that was naive. I held the phone against my ear and felt something loosen in my chest. And then I called Alistair. He answered quickly, as he always did. I told him about Geoffrey Strand's offer. There was a pause. I heard, he said. I want you to know I had no part in it. I know, I said. Benedict believes that everything in the world can be negotiated, Alistair said. He learned that from me, I think, and I'm not proud of it, but he hasn't learned what isn't for sale. A beat. Are you all right, Elowyn? It was the first time he had used my first name. It landed gently. I'm better than I was a month ago, I said, honestly. Good, he said. Don't back down. Whatever happens, don't let him convince you that you're alone in this. I wrote that in my notebook, too. Dated and timed, like everything else, but not as evidence, just for myself. They came on a Saturday, which told me everything about the strategy. Weekdays are professional. Weekdays mean offices and solicitors and the carefully maintained distance of formal business. Weekends are personal time. Dropping by on a Saturday says, this isn't business, this is family. It says, put down your professional armor and talk to us like a human being. I had lived 42 years in the world and understood manipulation well enough to recognize its packaging. Benedict arrived with his wife Helena, a slim, immaculately dressed woman in her early 40s, whose warmth had the precise, rehearsed quality of someone who had grown up performing it. She wore a camel coat and low heels. Her hair was perfect. She looked like an ambassador from a country that didn't technically exist. They brought flowers. Peonies. White and pink, wrapped in brown paper. A nice touch. Thoughtful without being excessive. Someone had advised them on the flowers. I was nearly certain of it. There is a specific kind of calculation that produces peonies instead of roses, brown paper instead of cellophane. And I recognized it for what it was. The aesthetics of sincerity, carefully assembled. I let them in because I wanted to hear what they had to say, and because Siobhan had advised it. Let them speak, don't interrupt. Learn everything you can. I remember standing at the door for a moment before I opened it, taking one deliberate breath, the kind you take before entering something you cannot walk back out of unchanged. We sat in my living room, the three of us. Benedict on the sofa, Helena beside him, me in the chair across. Marmalade came in, looked at both of them with the flat suspicion cats reserve for insincere people, and left. I found myself thinking, not for the first time, that animals are honest witnesses to things human beings have agreed to pretend they cannot see. Helena spoke first, which I suspected was intentional. Softer introduction. "We want to apologize," she said. "The way things have unfolded has been stressful for everyone, and I think some of the communication has been clumsy." She smiled warmly, regretfully. "Benedict has been worried about his father. That's all this has ever been, worry. And sometimes when we're worried, we handle things badly." I said nothing. I waited. Benedict leaned forward, elbows on his knees. His expression recalibrated into something approximating genuine openness. "My father is a good man," he said, "truly. And I understand he wanted to express gratitude to you. That's him. That's who he is." He paused. "But £30 million. Eloin, can I call you Eloin?" He didn't wait for permission. £30 million is not a token of gratitude. That's a decision that affects a foundation we've spent decades building. A foundation that employs thousands of people, that funds charitable work, that will one day serve his grandchildren. He met my eyes. "Do you really feel comfortable holding that? Knowing what it means to the people who depend on this family? Do you really feel comfortable?" 4 words designed to make the listener feel like a thief for saying yes. I looked at Benedict Sterling while sitting in my flat, on my sofa, with his beautiful wife and her expensive flowers, asking me to feel guilty about honesty. "I feel entirely comfortable," I said. Helena's expression flickered. She recovered in less than a second. She was practiced at recovery. But in that fraction of a moment, I had seen something real beneath the performance. Not guilt, precisely. Something more like recalculation. A quick, involuntary reassessment of how cooperative I was going to be. "Eloin." Benedict shifted slightly. A small motion, but I caught the change in register beneath his voice. The warmth retracted like a tide going out. "My father's doctors have expressed private concerns about his judgment over the past 18 months. I have documentation. If this goes to a formal legal challenge, it becomes public. It becomes a story. And whatever the outcome, the process will be unpleasant." He held my gaze. "For everyone." There it was, the velvet glove removed. "A story," he meant. "Your name in the news. A widow's wallet. A suspicious windfall." He meant, "We will make you look like a predator, and it won't matter that you're not." I felt it then. Fear, real, cold, specific fear. Not of Benedict exactly, but of what money can do, of how easily narrative can be manufactured, and how long it takes to dismantle one. But here is what I have learned about fear the hard way. It is not the opposite of courage. It is the fuel for it. I felt afraid, and I did not move. I stood, and I thought, every person who has ever been talked out of the truth by someone with more resources and more practiced authority has stood in a moment just like this one. The fear is always real. What matters is what you do while feeling it. "I have my own documentation," I said. "I've had it since the beginning. Every contact, every conversation, every number plate from the investigators you hired to watch my building." I kept my voice level. "I have Alistair's witness letter. I have my solicitor. I have a paper trail that is, in my solicitor's words, airtight." I looked at both of them. "If you'd like to take this to a formal legal challenge, that is absolutely your right. But I want you to know that I am not afraid of that process. And I want you to think carefully about what your father will say when he is called to give evidence about his own mental capacity." The room was very quiet. Benedict stood. Helena stood a half second later. "You're making a mistake," Benedict said. but the certainty had gone out of his voice. What was left was something closer to frustration. The sound of a man who expected the world to arrange itself and was confronted with a piece of it that wouldn't. "I thought about it carefully," I said, "and I disagree." They left the flowers on my coffee table, which told me Helena had no instructions for that particular scenario. I stood at my window and watched their car pull out of the car park below. My heart was beating fast, my palms were damp, but I noticed, with something like wonder, that I was still standing exactly where I had chosen to stand. The fear was real, and so was the decision. 2 weeks later, Siobhan called me at 7. 0 inches the morning. "Come to my office," she said, now. She hadn't said "as soon as you can," or "when you have a moment." She had said now. I was dressed and in my car within 12 minutes. The city was barely awake. Frost still sat on parked windscreens along Gloucester Road, and the early winter light came in pale and flat from the east, the kind of morning that holds itself in suspension. What she had found, through a careful, methodical examination of public and semi-public records, and with the help of a forensic document specialist she trusted, was this. 3 months prior to Alistair's call to me, Benedict Sterling had initiated a quiet legal process through a private solicitor in Bath. The filing was not public yet. It was in preliminary stage, but the goal was clear: to have Alistair H. Sterling declared legally incapacitated under the Mental Capacity Act, with Benedict named as his legal deputy. The application cited a neurologist report. The neurologist's name was Dr. Howard Knight. Siobhan had pulled Dr. Knight's GMC licensing records and found something interesting. He had no documented professional relationship with Alistair Sterling. No appointment records. No referral history. The report, which described vague cognitive inconsistencies, had been commissioned not by Alistair's GP, who had submitted his own letter on the record, stating that Alistair was in full cognitive health, but by Benedict's private solicitor. Siobhan laid it out on the desk in front of me, page by page. "He was building a case before you were ever in the picture," she said. "The wallet, the call, the £30 million that accelerated his timeline. But this was already in motion." I looked at the documents. The neurologist's report, the preliminary deputyship application, the letter from Alistair's actual GP. One doctor, Amara Singh, who'd been treating Alistair for 11 years, stating clearly that her patient showed no signs of cognitive impairment. "He was going to take control of the trust," I said. I said it aloud because I needed to hear it clearly outside my own head to confirm that what the documents showed was exactly what it appeared to be, and not something I had built out of fear or suspicion. Eventually, yes. Alistair has approximately £4.2 billion in assets. Under deputyship, Benedict would have overseen all of it. Siobhan paused. "What you accidentally became by being the recipient of that gift is a witness to Alistair's decision-making capacity at a specific moment in time. A very well-documented witness with a witness letter, a paper trail, and a solicitor." I sat with that for a moment. "We need to tell Alistair," I said. "Already called him this morning," Siobhan said. "He's meeting with his own legal team today, and he wants to see you." I met Alistair Sterling in person for the first time that afternoon. He was tall. I hadn't expected that. With the careful, deliberate movements of a man who had learned to take his time, he shook my hand and looked at me with clear, steady eyes that were nothing like the vague confusion a fraudulent neurologist had described in a filing. We sat together in his solicitor's conference room, his team, Siobhan, Alistair, and me. And Alistair listened as the full picture was laid out before him. He didn't interrupt. He didn't lose his composure. He asked 2 precise technical questions, and then sat quietly for a moment with his hands flat on the table. Then he called his son. Benedict arrived 40 minutes later, apparently believing it was a routine family meeting. He walked into the conference room and stopped when he saw me. When he saw Siobhan. When he saw the documents spread on the table. For a moment, I watched something rare. A man who had always had the next move prepared discover that there was no next move. He stood Rowett for 3 full seconds, long enough for everyone seated at the table to understand what his expression was communicating. Something he would never, under any circumstances, have chosen to say aloud. Alistair spoke first. His voice was calm in the way that only genuine authority can be. Not performed, not loud, just certain. "Benedict, I have reviewed the deputyship filing and the report from Dr. Knight. I've also spoken with Dr. Singh. I know what you attempted to do, and I know when you started." "Dad," Benedict began. "I'm not finished." Alistair's voice did not rise. "I am 71 years old. I am in full possession of my judgment. I gave Elowen Thorne £30 million because she is an honest person, and honesty of that kind is rarer than money. He looked at his son steadily. You attempted to have me declared legally incompetent in order to control my estate. That is a fact. It is documented. And it is one of the worst things you have ever done. Benedict's composure broke apart in layers, like ice cracking under pressure. First the jaw tightened, then the eyes. He looked at me with an expression I will not forget. Not hatred exactly, but something worse. The look of a man who realizes the world has witnesses. You have no idea what you've done, he said to me. I think I have a fairly good idea, I said. He turned to his father. Everything I did was for the family. For the business. You've lost perspective. I found it, Alistair said quietly. There was no performance in those 3 quiet words. Just the plain-weathered truth of a man who had looked at something clearly and named it, and was prepared to live with whatever that naming cost him. Benedict stood there for another moment. A long, terrible moment, in which the room was absolutely still. And then he walked out. No drama, no last words, just the sound of a door closing, and then the particular silence of something that is finally completely over. The formal proceedings that followed were swift by legal standards and thorough. Alistair's solicitor filed to formally dismiss the preliminary deputyship application, accompanied by Dr. Singh's unambiguous certification of Alistair's full cognitive capacity, a witness statement from Alistair himself, and a separate complaint to the General Medical Council regarding Dr. Howard Knight and the circumstances under which his report had been commissioned. Dr. Knight, when interviewed by the GMC's Fitness to Practice department, stated that he had been retained by a third-party consultant, not by Benedict directly, but that the scope of his examination had been guided by parameters provided by that consultant. The GMC opened a formal review. Dr. Knight's ability to practice was suspended pending investigation. The news found me during my lunch break, a small item on my phone that I almost scrolled past without reading. I sat at my desk in the back office and read it twice. Then I set the phone down and finished my sandwich and went back to work. There is something unexpectedly clarifying about watching institutional accountability move. Slowly, imperfectly, bureaucratically, but actually move in the direction of truth. Benedict's private solicitor in Bath filed a notice of withdrawal from the deputyship matter and declined to comment publicly. Siobhan filed a civil claim on Alistair's behalf, alleging fraudulent misrepresentation in the procurement of a medical report, intentional interference with Alistair's financial autonomy, and commission of elder abuse, which, under the law, includes financial exploitation or attempted exploitation. Alistair did not consider himself vulnerable, but his solicitor pointed out, with some satisfaction, that the law applied to the attempt. Benedict's own legal team moved to settle within 3 weeks of the claim being filed. Alistair refused the settlement. He needs to understand that there are things you cannot settle out of, he told me, when I called to check in on a cold December evening. Is that hard? I asked. He's your son. A pause. It's the hardest thing I've done in years, Alistair said honestly. But allowing it would be harder for him, in the end, more than anyone. The case went to a formal legal proceeding in February. Benedict, through counsel, eventually agreed to a consent order, not an admission of guilt in the criminal sense, but a legally binding agreement requiring him to undergo a formal audit of all financial decisions made in connection with Sterling Systems over the prior 2 years, to step down as COO, and to submit to court oversight of any involvement in Sterling family trust matters for a period of 5 years. He was not prosecuted criminally because Alistair would not go that far for his son. But he was not protected either. I thought about that for a long time. The line between mercy and abdication is one of the hardest a parent can walk. And Alistair had walked it without flinching. He had let the law do what it was built to do, which is not a small thing when the person the law is moving toward is someone you love. I wrote nothing in my notebook about that. Some things are too private to document, even when you're the witness. As for me, the gift stood. Legally confirmed. The documentation was impeccable. A formal deed of gift had been executed and recorded, and the transfer was registered as a potentially exempt transfer for inheritance tax purposes, meaning that as long as Alistair lived for 7 more years, no inheritance tax would ever fall due on it. Siobhan had worked with a financial advisor named James O'Say, calm, meticulous, excellent to establish a properly structured account from which I could begin making considered decisions about the money. In February, on the same week the consent order was signed, I met Alistair for tea at a small cafe near his home in Snade Park. He was in good spirits, wearing a blue jumper that made him look less like a billionaire and more like someone's reassuring grandfather. "How are you holding up?" I asked. "Remarkably well," he said, and I believed him. There was something lighter in him than there had been in our earlier conversations, as if something he had been carrying for a long time had been set down. "I want to ask you something," I said. "Why 30 million? He smiled into his tea. "Because 300 was what you found," he said. "And I wanted to make sure you understood what that kind of honesty is actually worth." I thought about that for a long moment. "You could have just said, 'Thank you,'" I said. "I could have," he agreed. "But you wouldn't have believed it." He was probably right. Spring came to Bristol the way it always does. Slowly, then all at once. By March, the trees along the Avon were beginning to bud, and the paths were full again with people who had forgotten over the long winter that the city contained so much open sky. I was still working at the library. I want to be clear about that. Not out of financial necessity. I didn't need the salary anymore, not remotely. But because I loved it, because helping a 9-year-old find the right book, or sitting with a teenager who needed somewhere quiet and non-judgmental to exist for an hour, or watching a first-generation immigrant work through an English-language learning resource with fierce patient concentration, those things mattered to me. They had always mattered to me. Money had not changed what mattered, but I was able to do more now. With Siobhan's guidance and James's financial planning, I had established the Thorn Honesty Fund. Not an official name, just what Paula called it. A charitable foundation focused on educational access in underserved West Country communities. The first grants went out in March. £400,000 to 3 Bristol State schools for library renovation and expansion. I attended the announcement at one of the schools, stood in the back of the gym, and watched children run their hands along new bookshelves with the particular reverence kids reserve for things that feel important. I thought about the wallet. I thought about the choice I had made in 45 seconds on a cold October pavement. I thought about how the world sometimes runs on tiny pivots. The foundation grew quickly because Alistair quietly, without making it about himself, introduced me to 3 other British philanthropists who were interested in education funding. Within 6 months, the foundation had committed £2.1 million in grants. By the end of the year, we had a small staff, a proper board, and a wait list of applicants. I moved to a different flat, not dramatically larger, but with 2 more windows and a second bedroom that became my home office. There I spent weekend mornings working on grant proposals and foundation strategy, while Marmalade watched from the windowsill. Paula came to visit in April, and we spent a Saturday walking along the river in the warm afternoon light, and she said, "You seem like yourself, more than you have in years." I thought about that for days afterward. She was right. I was more myself. Not because of the money, or not only because of it, but because of the test the money had brought, and the fact that I had not failed it. Benedict Sterling's story, as it reached me through Siobhan and through the occasional news item, was not a happy one. The consent order, and the GMC investigation into Dr. Knight, became public in April. A brief item in the Business West Journal, then a longer piece in the local paper. The coverage was measured and factual, but the facts were damaging. 2 of Sterling System's largest municipal contracts came up for renewal that spring, and both Bristol City Council and the Department for Transport requested additional compliance review before signing. Both contracts were eventually renewed, but the process was expensive and humiliating. Benedict had resigned as COO in February under the terms of the consent order. He retained his title as a board member, but with no operational role. Multiple executives who had worked closely with him over the years quietly updated their LinkedIn profiles and began taking meetings elsewhere. Helena filed for divorce in May. The filing was straightforward and civil. Her solicitor later told Siobhan in passing that Helena had, in the end, found it surprisingly easy to separate from a man she realized she'd never fully trusted. I did not feel satisfaction about any of that exactly. Or if I did, I held it lightly and set it down quickly. What Benedict had tried to do to his own father, the clinical coldness of it, the patience, the documents, it was not something I could be glad about in any simple way. It was a grief, primarily. A family grief that wasn't mine to carry. Alistair and I met for tea every few weeks through that spring and into summer. He was considering a new philanthropic initiative of his own, a workforce training program for rural communities, and wanted a sounding board. I was glad to be one. We had arrived without planning it at something that resembled a genuine friendship. 2 people who had met through a strange particular turn of events and found that they actually liked each other. One afternoon in June, sitting on the terrace of a cafe with iced tea and the long summer light falling across the table, Alistair said, I used to think about what kind of world I was leaving behind. The buildings, the company, the endowments, concrete things. He looked out toward the hills. I think about that differently now. What do you think about now? I asked. People, he said simply, one at a time. I understood exactly.